Hello, and welcome to another Webinar Wednesday by Smartkarma. I'm Michael Tegos. Today, I'm delighted to welcome back to the webinar Manu Bhaskaran, who will explore the economic factors and key trends that point to new opportunities in ASEAN in the aftermath of COVID, as well as the region's prospects given the further shifts that are caused by the war in Ukraine. A few words about Manu. He is a leading Asia economist with more than 30 years of experience in studying economic, political, and security issues that shape the business environment in Asia. He coordinates the Asian business of Washington, D.C.-based strategic advisory firm Centennial Group, directing its Asian economic research practice, which provides in-depth analysis of macro trends in Asia. He works extensively with investment institutions, government agencies, and corporations, and regularly presents his views on the economic, political, and business environment in Asia at business conferences and in-house briefings. He is a member of the Regional Advisory Group for Asia and the Pacific International Monetary Fund. As always, please feel free to send in your questions for Manu throughout the webinar using the Q&A button on your Zoom app. We will do our best to get to them at the Q&A section at the end. And please do not reshare the contents of this webinar without express permission. As always, we will have a recording available on the page that you used to register for this session. With that, Manu, thank you very much for joining us once again today. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Michael. And good afternoon, good morning, everyone, as the case might be. I'd like to talk about two things today. One is to look at the near term and sketch out what we think will be the implications of recent developments. And essentially, our argument is that by and large, on the scenario that we have assumed, the ASEAN economies should be able to weather the storm. The second part of my presentation will focus on the longer term and to look at the challenging environment, post-COVID, post-Ukraine, whatever, and understand the structural changes there and how ASEAN might respond. And I really want to make a case for ASEAN enjoying an acceleration of economic growth and transformation in a very positive manner. And I think there are two elements to that story. One is that there are enough positive drivers, even in that challenging environment, for ASEAN to leverage off. And secondly, I think that over the last few years, some key countries in ASEAN have been improving their domestic capacity through various means and reforms, and they are in a better position to exploit those advantages and also to be resilient to some of the downside risks. So that's the essential story. And let me now start with the near term. I need to make clear what my assumptions are, and so I'm laying out my scenarios. I'll focus on the baseline scenario because that is what drives our forecast. And essentially, we see a 60% probability of this baseline, which is that the war continues for in very intensive level for a few weeks more, and then settles into a still an unpleasant military situation, but not the kind of intense fighting that we are seeing today. The Russians take much of Eastern Europe, including the capital city, but a rump Ukraine remains under an independent government backed by the West and its neighbors, and given aid by the US and its European allies, aid that will also flow to insurgents in the Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. And that means that you have a tense situation continuing, but the West being quite careful not to push Mr. Putin too far because they don't want this to escalate into something much worse. Russia will probably see a recession, but Mr. Putin will probably continue in power, given his control over the security agencies and so on. And the key assumption one is making here is that despite some media reports to the contrary, I think Mr. Putin is an entirely rational player, calculates very carefully and cold-bloodedly, not a nice man, but rational. Spillovers to Asia are inevitable, and they will center around China. I think China will look at its relationship with Russia in a highly transactional manner and will conclude that it is better off backing Russia, even though that will result, I think, in some increased trade and other aggressive measures by the US to penalize China, as Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, has already warned. I think it also means that for China, the competition with the US for influence in Asia, but particularly in Southeast Asia, that competition is going to intensify, and that will have consequences for our part of the world. So that's the baseline scenario. I have a couple of other scenarios for interest, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move straight into what this means, this baseline scenario means. And what I'm really saying is that the very difficult part of the war, when there are all kinds of fears of that are difficult to quantify and assess, how bad will the sanctions be? What will Mr. Putin do? What risk is there of escalation? Will there be some kind of missile attack on a nuclear installation and that cause mayhem? That intense period of great uncertainty that really pains investors, businesses, and so on will subside in a couple of months. And we'll move into a different phase, still not a nice phase, but a phase where the risk premium basically comes down because there's greater clarity on all these issues that currently really trouble people. So if you look at that scenario, then I think what we see happening is that the sharp spike in oil and related prices, you'll probably see oil prices averaging about $95 this quarter, and then beginning to ease in the second quarter, and then fall more significantly by the end of 2022, when oil prices will be roughly below year-ago levels of prices. As a result, the financial markets should stabilize, and so the outflows from emerging market assets should ease. Global growth obviously will take a hit in the second quarter, but I suspect, given the scenario, that it will regain some of that lost momentum as we move into the second half of the year. Similarly, inflation will spike in the first half of the year, but then ease by the year end. So in that context, and assuming that scenario is correct, what are the implications for ASEAN? I think the key point I want to make here is that the ASEAN growth outlook is a product not just of the Ukraine crisis, although that is important, but of multiple forces. Now, what are the channels of impact of what Ukraine has done? The main channel is through high energy costs, which clearly hit businesses worldwide. They cut back hiring, they cut back capacity expansion, they go slow on orders, and activity slows. The business uncertainty, it's the rebound in investment, and all that flows back into Asia in terms of our export outlook, our own businesses being less confident and hesitant about hiring and expanding. So that produces a hit to growth, particularly in the second quarter of the year. Clearly, the second big implication is higher inflation. And inflation in ASEAN will follow the pattern I outlined for global inflation. But this is a bad situation, there's no doubt about it, and I'm not downplaying it. But do remember that there are other factors. And the big factor, which I think is really powerful, is that we are coming to the end of this miserable pandemic. I believe that we will, even if we see future variants and all that, I think given the advances in clinical management, new therapies, vaccines, and so on, and the consequent sharp fall in mortality and morbidity rates, the drag that any new variant will cause on economic activity will be much reduced compared to before. So essentially, in terms of the economic damage done by the pandemic, we are at the tail end. And that means, I think, starting in a couple of months' time, significant unleashing of pent-up demand, consumer spending, business investment coming back. And in particular, I think there's going to be huge comeback in tourism revenue as cross-border travel resumes. For the labor importing economies in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, there'll be some easing of the labor crunch as well. And I think generally you'll see an easing of the dislocations in the supply chains. And that produces a growth response, which helps ASEAN mitigate the impact, the definite negative impact of the Ukraine crisis. In addition, if we look at what Prime Minister Li Keqiang spoke about in his Saturday message to the National People's Congress meeting, I think it's quite clear now that China is stepping up on its stimulus, and a lot of that is going to be led by fiscal spending. So that also adds to growth potential in Southeast Asia. So putting it all together, our expectation right now is that economic growth in most of the countries that we're looking at in Southeast Asia will pick up. In Singapore, it doesn't pick up because last year was reasonably good, but it still remains well above Singapore's potential growth. So it's actually a very good year for Singapore too. In terms of monetary policy implications, I think we see a move towards tightening in most of the ASEAN countries, starting with Singapore, with Thailand being the laggard in this respect. So that's the near-term impact, and I'd like to now talk about the longer term. As I said, there are two pillars to our argument. One is that despite the great increase in global challenges as a result of the pandemic, as a result of big power confrontation, as a result of the long-term impact of what happened in Ukraine, despite that, I would say that overall, there are some very significant positive drivers of growth in the global economy. Secondly, I believe that ASEAN's reforms, various initiatives for development in the last few years has strengthened its capacity to take advantage of these positive drivers and to withstand some of the downside risks. So let me explain what I mean by that. First of all, let me try and sketch out as far as we can what the new global context for ASEAN is likely to be. First of all, in the political arena, clearly there is going to be a prolonged and more intense period of big power contestation, the West versus China and Russia. A new Cold War, or whatever it is you want to call it, is now going to unfold before us. And that will mean a bifurcated world. There will be decoupling, China and Russia decoupling from the Western-dominated financial and economic systems. I believe that the increased hostility towards China, which results from its friendship with Russia, will be used as a cover for more protectionism. And that protectionism is bound to spill over in some ways into Southeast Asia as well. I also see more inward-looking policies being pursued, not just by China and Russia for obvious reasons, but even in countries like the United States. And that means that we're not going to see as dynamic a growth in world trade as we would like to see. We are not going to see the end of globalization, but we will see slow globalization. So world trade will grow, but much more slowly than before. I think China is going to make some very hard decisions. I think the Chinese leadership, looking at what happened in terms of Western resolve, which I think they underestimated, in terms of sanctions and the extent to which the West is going to penalize Russia for its war on Ukraine, I think is a shock to China. And even in the last few years, there was a growing determination in China to gradually decouple and reduce its vulnerability to being sanctioned or penalized or pressured in any way by the United States. I think all that is going to accelerate significantly. And in some areas where the decisions are really going to be difficult, such as how they reduce their dependence on US dollar settlement and their foreign exchange reserves, that requires very difficult decisions for them on their capital account and management of the currency. But I think those decisions will be made in the next year or so. I think countries will want to shift away even faster from their dependence on fossil fuels so that they can reduce their dependence on autocratic regimes. And I think it is inevitable that you will see a large and sustained rise in defense spending. Now, defense spending is largely seen as wasteful, and that's basically correct. But in this case, there could be some positive technological spillovers because there's going to be incredible increase in research and development because of the nature of war today. Closer to home, I believe there's going to be a reduction in the risk of confrontation over Taiwan in the very near term. I think China will need to rethink its approach to Taiwan. China's basic assumption, very fundamental to its worldview and clearly articulated by the President Xi Jinping himself, is that the West is in terminal decline, particularly the United States. China, on the other hand, is on the rise, on the ascendant, and that is what gave Xi Jinping the courage and motivation to move aggressively in certain areas, right? I think seeing the response and the greater unification of US and Europe and Japan, China will have to rethink its approach. It certainly is not going to give up on its aim of reunification with Taiwan, but the strategy, I think, will shift towards emasculation and subversion of Taiwan rather than banking on an outright invasion or direct military assault of some kind. And I think that shift basically buys us some time in East Asia. That doesn't mean that China is not going to do anything to Taiwan. China will keep sending signals to Taiwan. There will be increased harassment, more fighter jets going into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, things like that. But in terms of a major confrontation that some people had feared, I think we bought some time. Finally, I should mention there is always North Korea. We don't know what they are likely to do, but a distracted US could mean that the North Koreans feel encouraged to, undertake some kind of provocation or something. Who knows? But we need to look out for that. In terms of the economy, we have a bifurcated world, greater protectionism. So clearly, Southeast Asian policymakers will have to think very hard about how they mitigate that. And I suspect there will be a greater push for bilateral free trade agreements, economic partnership agreements of various kinds in order to try and mitigate that risk as much as possible. The other thing I fear is that because of this protectionism and inward policies in large countries, some economic policymakers, say in Indonesia perhaps, might argue that the export-led model is not going to work and that their country should really focus more on very inward-looking import substituting type of development. I think that would be very negative, but that is clearly a risk that we need to watch out for. The next thing to look out for is a reconfiguration of supply chains or production networks, as you might want to call it, where rich developed countries can bring production home profitably and sensibly in strategic items like semiconductors, electronics, and pharmaceuticals. I think there will be an effort to do so. So there will be some increase in reshoring, I think. But I think there'll be more nearshoring in that production will be brought back to lower cost economies neighboring rich countries. And this could be Mexico, it could be Turkey, it could be Morocco that benefits. But there will still be, I think, considerable scope for continued offshoring, but probably there will be a decision made by many countries that production in China, to some extent, should be relocated elsewhere. And where there is a case for relocation out of China, where that case does exist, I think it will be Southeast Asia, primarily that benefits. Finally, I think the US, China, and also Japan are going to compete even harder for influence in Southeast Asia. So I can see China stepping up, reinvigorating its Belt and Road Initiative. I can see the Chinese, the Americans and the Japanese responding. And don't forget, even the middle powers, Korea and Taiwan, have put in place ambitious schemes to engage Southeast Asia. And that means, I think, a greater flow of aid, of foreign direct investment, of loans to our region, and also efforts to move the region through things like improved market access and so on. These are, I think, considerable positives. I would also like to emphasize that the trends that have been underway for some time, but were delayed perhaps by COVID, will still operate to the benefit of Southeast Asia. I think there's going to be a huge, there's potential for a big investment upcycle in the world economy if some of these issues that we are talking about today can be settled soon. I think there are multiple technologies that are taking off simultaneously. I spoke about them in my last presentation. It's not just in the infotech area, it's also in renewables, in biomedical, in defense, in new materials. And each of these new technologies feeds on the other, helping the other, pulling the other up and creating an upward spiral. I think this creates a compelling case for businesses to step up capital spending to achieve higher productivity, to remain competitive, and to exploit new business models and not fall behind their competitors. I also see increased efforts to adapt to climate change and to mitigate, and that will reinforce this capital spending. You just think about the amount of money that's already going into new high voltage electricity grids, which renewable energy needs, or charging stations, you'll see why. And finally, there are big infrastructure plans already being implemented in the US and Europe, and likely to be reinvigorated in Asia, and that will also add to this investment cycle. And I think that is positive for Southeast Asia. Here, I've just made a list of, just from the media, a list of company announcements and massive investment plans. I don't think many of these are going to be downscaled because there's a compelling case for this. Right? The second element of my argument is that Southeast Asia has improved. Of course, there are many areas of disappointment, and but overall, I think there are enough reforms in place, enough new initiatives in place to boost ASEAN's capacity to exploit these global trends. So I think once the COVID pandemic eases, we'll see a renewed and very large push for infrastructure spending. That's positive for growth in the near term because it boosts demand, investment goes up, but more powerfully, for the long term, it improves the efficiency of economies, brings down costs, and encourages a lot more investments, makes the economies more competitive. Secondly, there's been the cumulative impact of modest reforms. The labor market reforms in Indonesia, I think, are significant. They reduce redundancy costs, introduce greater flexibility. They don't go as far as we would like them to go, but it's a pretty good move anyway. Foreign direct investment rules have been eased in Indonesia and the Philippines. Business ecosystems have been made more friendly through deregulation, cutting red tape, and the like. And then you have synergies from regional integration. RCEP is now in force a few weeks ago. The CPTPP is already in force. More countries are joining. The Greater Mekong sub-region has been effective for many years and continues to grow. I see great scope in the next few years for cross-border cooperation and integration. For instance, I wouldn't be surprised if Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia got together and revived the old growth triangle idea from the 1990s. And I think to conclude, I think, ASEAN is showing a capacity to become more competitive in wooing foreign direct investment compared to the big Asian economies of China and India. So to conclude, the question is whether ASEAN can regain its position as a preeminent destination for global capital. And my answer is that probably yes. I think the pandemic and the Ukraine crisis clearly will create challenges, but these can be mitigated or overcome because there are these other positive trends in the global environment that I mentioned, and because ASEAN has actually worked hard to improve its own internal capacity. As long as ASEAN maintains competent policies and avoids major political risks, I think it's poised to enjoy a material acceleration in economic prospects. I think Indonesia and Vietnam are going to deliver the greatest upside, but I would not underestimate a country like the Philippines. And Singapore clearly it's not going to grow as fast as it grew in the past because it's already a rich country, but it's going to enjoy another burst of growth as a vibrant regional hub if the region around it does well. So let me end here, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insights, Manu. This has been very educational, I have to say. As Manu mentioned, you can send in any questions you might have through the Q&A button on your Zoom app. We already have a few questions from the audience, actually, so let's get to them. An attendee comments that the amazing thing that's unfolding in the current Russia-Ukraine conflict is how the private sector companies are also reacting by withdrawing from Russia and blocking access to their services. That is something that did not occur during recent Russian conflicts. Trade between the US and Russia continued regardless. So the attendee's question is, why has that occurred? What impact does that have for non-US corporates? And would China be able to afford a similar blockade should they move against Taiwan?
Thank you. Very interesting, which means very difficult question. But let me try and answer. I think why? You can see with the mood shift on things like gender diversity, sustainability, climate, and so on, that shareholders, stakeholders, civil society can be very unforgiving of companies that are seen to be selfish or amoral, right? And I think the penny has dropped with the CEOs and boards of these companies that they have to be proactive. They cannot wait to be criticized on social media before responding. So I think a lot of these large corporations felt that they had to do it. Of course, in this particular instance, I think there's also this deep sense of outrage that this could happen in Europe, a developed place where the hope had been that large-scale conflict was a thing of the past. I think there was that additional outrage at that, and of course the Ukrainians, resolve in fighting, their leaders' ability to communicate, that his great courage, I think, has been extremely inspiring. So I think that all added up to produce that. What impact? I mean, clearly, the economic impact is severe. That companies are willing, like oil companies willing to write off a $25 billion investment in Rosneft. I mean, that is really major, right? And that means there's going to be earnings risk, right, for financial markets, because a lot of companies are probably going to announce rather bad earnings. But it also means that the economic impact on Russia is greater. And this is very important because I don't think Mr. Putin calculated that there would be this kind of response. I think this is completely out of the field for them. And that is a lesson that will be taken away by other countries that had, thought of engaging in provocative actions. I think in a funny sort of way, and here I'm speaking as a Singaporean from a tiny city-state country that is utterly vulnerable to the outside world. No small country is going to be safe if this kind of violation of international norms is allowed to go unpunished. So for smaller countries, this sort of warning shot to powerful countries that had bad intentions makes the world safer, frankly, for small countries. So I'm not unhappy about that. What about China? Now, I think we, if you look at how China operates, and particularly if you look at how Mr. Xi Jinping operates, remember, Xi Jinping has a remarkable sense of political timing. He never moves, at least so far, into any political clash without being sure that he's going to win. So he chooses his battles very carefully. He is extremely rational and thinks very hard. I don't think the Chinese are going, even before Ukraine, I don't think the Chinese were going to rush into any kind of invasion of Taiwan. I think their preferred, strategy would be something different, to sort of ramp up so much military pressure and wait for the US to decline and then just, walk in, unimpeded. I think that was their hope. So I don't see China getting into the kind of mess that Mr. Putin has dragged poor Russia into it. I mean, we sympathize with Ukraine, but we should also sympathize with the Russian people. They've been dragged into this, right? I don't see the current Chinese leadership, and not just Xi Jinping, the current Chinese leadership doing anything so foolish and so poorly thought through. So, however, the key point here is China learns. Again, you look at China under different leaders over the last 30, 40 years. They're not fools. They learn from the mistakes of other countries, right? And China will be looking at what happened in Ukraine, looking at Russia's tactical and strategic errors in Ukraine, military, diplomatic, and otherwise. And they will incorporate that into their military strategy, into their military doctrine, and into their diplomatic initiatives. And for sure, I repeat what I just said, there is going to be a significant overhaul of how China interacts economically, financially with the rest of the world. And I think that's the big implication for our part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you for breaking that down for us so succinctly. We have a question from Mr. Pete Kane, who asks, can you talk about how ASEAN as a bloc approaches and deals with the new China and what this means for ASEAN?
Thank you. Well, I think some basic things about ASEAN, right? One is that ASEAN is divided. Second is that ASEAN is probably weaker organizationally than it was 15, 20 years ago. I mean, the equivalent, historic development was in December 1978, right? When Vietnam invaded Cambodia. Now, there were good reasons for Vietnam to move into Cambodia, because Cambodia at that time was run by a very nasty regime, but Vietnam had other motives as well. And the ASEAN countries took the view that this is a violation of a basic norm in Southeast Asia. We don't like the idea of countries invading others, and imposing puppet regimes and so on. ASEAN got together, overcame its divisions. Of course, at that time, it was 5 countries, but Indonesia was very close to Vietnam. But Indonesia felt that to preserve ASEAN unity, it would sacrifice its relationship with Vietnam to some extent in order to help Thailand face up to Vietnamese troops being on its border. And ASEAN came together despite its divisions and fought together and was diplomatically very effective in raising the cost to Vietnam so much, of course, with help from China, that eventually Vietnam had to withdraw from Cambodia, and Cambodia, for better or worse, is an independent country now. That was ASEAN at its best. I wish I could say that ASEAN was going to be as effective today, but I can't. It is divided. We can't handle Myanmar. Indonesia is no longer exerting the kind of leadership that Suharto was bold enough to exert. And institutionally, it has not grown in the last 40 years to match the huge changes in the global environment and in the region, and in terms of ASEAN's own responsibilities. So it is a weaker organization. So honestly, ASEAN is not going to respond to new China or new anything in a unified, cohesive way. It is going to be the individual countries responding individually, or maybe blocks of countries within ASEAN, allying each other on specific issues, rather than ASEAN as a coherent force operating. And I wish I could say differently, but that is the hard reality.
Understood. Thank you for that. We have quite a few questions coming in, so I will combine a couple which deal with similar themes. So one question is, which country in ASEAN has the potential to rebound the most? And are there any particular sectors that you like and that investors in ASEAN nations should focus on?
I guess potential rebound refers to the near term, right? So
I assume so.
So I think if you're talking about the near term, the country that has really done really badly in this pandemic has been Thailand. Thailand had a number of problems. One is that the government's response was not so efficient in terms of stimulus and so on, countervailing measures. And secondly, of course, it was greatly exposed to tourism. We estimate that the direct and indirect effects of tourism, roughly about 18-19% of GDP. So tourism is much more important in Thailand than elsewhere, and it took a big hit. So the snapback in tourism will be most powerfully felt in Thailand. And you can see, even with the Omicron infection wave causing number of infections to be quite high, the Thai government has gone ahead to relax border controls and to encourage a new wave of tourism. Now, of course, Chinese tourists are not going to come back at any time, and that is about 30% plus of the total. And Russian tourists, who are a source of new growth, clearly not going to come either. But I think there will be enough growth from the rest of East Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as India, Australia, and Europe, to produce a huge recovery of tourism in Thailand. So I think in the near term, Thailand could be the country that enjoys the smartest rebound. Singapore actually is having a good year this year. Again, despite, even with, Ukraine and so on, you've got these huge investments that the Economic Development Board had attracted to Singapore coming on stream. And that adds to factory, production and so on in a very meaningful manner. For instance, Hyundai's first electrical vehicles will roll out of their production plant by the end of the year, probably by October, November. That's huge. That's a huge investment. And there are other huge investments as well. The easing of the labor constraint as Malaysian and other foreign workers are allowed to return to Singapore will help the labor constrained sectors like construction and marine services and so on. You've got a lot of pent-up consumer demand as well, helping. So put it all together, and I think Singapore will have a very strong year as well, even though, in terms of headline rates of economic growth, because we are already a rich country, can't expect us to grow by 10, 14% anymore. But, 5%, which we penned for Singapore, is actually very, very strong for Singapore. In terms of our numbers, Vietnam also does extremely well, if you look at our forecasts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Staying with ASEAN, two attendees have more specific questions about the outlook on Malaysia on the one hand, and then on your point about the Philippines potentially seeing higher growth. So if you could comment on that a little bit.
Sure. So Malaysia, remember, Malaysia is one of the most open economies in the world. After Hong Kong and Singapore and I think Vietnam, it's got one of the highest trade to GDP ratios in the world. So if global demand continues to recover, as I suspect will, probably not as strongly as we would have hoped because of Ukraine, Malaysia will benefit. Malaysia benefits from the huge ramp up of oil prices and the knock-on effect on crude palm oil, which is another big export of Malaysia. So if CPO prices rise, then the rural sector, a few 100,000 families that are smallholders will benefit hugely. So I think, and of course, the return of tourism helps Malaysia as well. Finally, I think, a lot depends on the state assembly election in Johor, which is coming this weekend. But if it goes the way that the ruling party UMNO wants, we're probably going to see an early election by about July, I guess. And that could result in a coalition government with a solid majority, ending this period of great political uncertainty that has deterred investment and business optimism. So put it all together, if everything goes well, Malaysia could have a very good year this year. Longer term, I think Malaysia has some structural difficulties, and it has to deal with that. Productivity growth has been held back by, I think, wrong-headed policy on foreign workers. The education system needs to be ramped up so that the development of human capital can be improved. Malaysia needs to really think hard about the deleterious impact of the way the affirmative action program has been set up. So I think there are some deep structural issues that need to be addressed, but certainly this year, Malaysia looks good. On the Philippines, some people's views on the Philippines is very much informed by their perception of the president of the Philippines. But my view is, if you look at the economy, and in particular the economic team that runs the economy, led by the finance minister, but also ably supported by the budget minister, the planning minister, and so on. This is a very good team, extremely good team. And over the years, they have put together, reforms of the economy, sectoral reforms, as well as a big improvement in infrastructure spending as a proportion of GDP. And they have just recently back some of the very tight restrictions on foreign investment. So, I wouldn't be surprised if the Philippines can go back to growing by 6 to 7% a year. And this is a country that for decades underperformed. There's a lot of catch-up potential there. Also, don't forget that the global demographic trends really play to the advantage of the Philippines. The Philippines has very strong demographics. And unlike many other countries with strong population growth, the Philippines does educate its people. And that's why you have so many Filipinos moving abroad. I think there's great potential, not just for Filipino workers going abroad, but for business process outsourcing, the gig economy, and so on, producing well-paid jobs in the Philippines in future. So for those reasons, I'm reasonably optimistic about the Philippines.
Thank you for that. In the interest of time, we have a couple of questions that involve sanctions against Russia. So I will try to combine those as well. One involved the implications of Singapore imposing sanctions against Russia. So what would you think are the economic and geopolitical implications there? And a second question asks whether ASEAN countries can benefit in any way from the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia.
Thanks. Singapore, again, you have to go back to history, right? Following the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in 1978, it was Singapore, a tiny country, that really went to the front line, in a sense, diplomatically, to push ASEAN and its allies elsewhere to take a strong stand on that particular issue. And we have a similar situation here in the Singapore leaders' perception, because we are a small country. We cannot allow the situation where a large country just invades another country and declares its sovereignty to be non-existent. No way, right? And the Singapore leadership's view, whether you agree with it or not, but the view is that it's not enough to just worry about these things. You got to show, you got to do something, you got to make a sacrifice if necessary. And so much as we don't like to, do things against Russia, I think the government felt that it had to signal that and put its money where its mouth was, right? But I don't think the sanctions are a huge thing. Russia is not a huge market for Singapore's goods. Neither is it a huge market for Singapore's exportable services in finance or whatever. Will it scare other high net worth individuals who park their money in Singapore? I doubt it. I think it is a diplomatic signal, but I don't think it will hurt Singapore's economy in any material way. Can ASEAN benefit from sanctions? I'm not sure that I think in this in a sort of longer term way, yes. It is quite clear if you're sitting in the C-suite of a big multinational corporation with production locations across the world, you really have to think harder now about political risk. What happens to your supply chain if there is a further intensification of big power rivalries and frictions, right? You probably want to be in a more neutral place than in a controversial place. And in that sense, that's why I'm more confident now about this whole thing about production relocation. I think, you see, people get thrown off by surveys of Chinese-based MNCs And the consistent theme coming from those surveys is that they are unlikely to move, which is not a surprise. You're already in China and you're producing for the domestic market, you're obviously not going to move. But if you're in China and you're producing for exports, and you are now much more concerned about these political ramifications, then I think you start diversifying. And where you can, quietly, without making too much drama out of it, you move your production. It might be to Vietnam, it might be to Indonesia, because Indonesia is becoming more investable, or it could be to Malaysia and Thailand, or it could be, in some circumstances, to a place like Bangladesh or even India. So I think in that sense, they might benefit. The other is, of course, not so much from the sanctions, but because there is, like I said, we are now in an era of intense and prolonged contestation between the big powers. Big powers need allies. A big power like China now knows that sea lanes of communication, like the Straits of Malacca, South China Sea, now very important, right? And Southeast Asia sits astride those very critical sea lanes of communication. I think there will be a bigger push by the big powers to try to woo Southeast Asian countries. And that means, as I said earlier, more aid, more investment, lots of goodies in terms of concessions made during trade negotiations and the like. So I think ASEAN could benefit from that.
Thank you for that. And thank you for tackling all the questions from the audience. And thank you everyone for attending and for sharing your questions with Manu. I'm afraid that is all we have time for today, but I want to remind everyone that if you wish to engage Manu for bespoke research requests, you can always contact your Smartkarma account manager and they will help you out in this regard. And of course, I will recommend that you follow Manu's profile on Smartkarma so that you don't miss any of his insights. If you have any other questions or comments, you can always email us at research@smartkarma.com. If you have any additional questions for Manu, we will also pass them along through there. Manu, thank you very much for being so generous with your time today and for appearing in our webinar once again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.